My name is Michael Hill, and I have the privilege of serving as the 18th president of Chautauqua Institution, and it's my pleasure. Thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the amphitheater this afternoon for this special program and conversation. What an honor and privilege to welcome our distinguished guest this afternoon, the Junior United States Senator from New York, Kirsten Gillibrand. Since she was first elected to Congress, Senator Gillibrand has been a leader on some of the toughest fights in Washington. She wrote and passed the Stock Act, led the effort to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and passed the historic 9/11 health bill, which ensured first responders and survivors got the health care they deserved. More recently, she helped pass provisions from her bill making gun trafficking a federal crime as part of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And she helped lead the fight to pass the PACT Act, which ensured veterans exposed to toxins during their service would get the care and benefits they earned. After a nearly decade-long fight against the epidemic of sexual assault in the military, she led the passage of critical reforms to the military justice system. She is a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Senate Agriculture Committee, and Senate Aging Committee. And as I said to her, maybe a first in her career, Bob Woodward was her warm-up act. It's our honor to host Senator Gillibrand and her son Henry this morning on what is a return visit to Chautauqua. Please join me in offering a warm Chautauqua welcome to our Senator, Kirsten Gillibrand.
Well, thank you so much to President Hill for his introduction, but also your leadership and your vision, and for giving so much love and care to this Chautauqua community. Thank you so much, President Hill. So I was very excited that this week's talk was about democracy and what we can do to strengthen our democracy and why our democracy in the United States is so vibrant and so essential. It's an important discussion to be having right now, given the news every day. And we have seen in the last year or so too many of our rights and freedoms being stripped away. We know now more than ever before that we need to make our voices heard. We need to fight for what we know is right, not because it's easy, not even because it's hard, but because it's necessary for the future of our democracy and the future of this country. That's a message that I learned early on from my grandmother. My grandmother never went to college. She was a secretary in our state legislature. And right out of high school, she started working as an 18-year-old in our state legislature. And she looked around the room and she noticed that most of the legislators were men and that women had very few roles to play except for support roles. So she decided that role is pretty important, and we are going to organize and make sure that our voices are heard in the legislators' agenda, in what they're doing while they are governing and what they're doing when they're campaigning. And so those women organized themselves around New York State's government and made sure that they elected candidates that shared their values. I was lucky enough to be brought along with her as a 10-year-old girl, knocking on doors, stuffing envelopes. I remember the first time I went into a campaign headquarters and there was a room full of women all stuffing their envelopes, and I remember thinking to myself, I want to be just like them someday. And sure enough, I am. I didn't really realize how important democracy was to me, though, until I was a bit older. I was a young lawyer living and working in New York City, and I really wanted to get involved in politics. So I called my mother's friend about how do I get involved in New York City. And she said, there's a new group, it's called the Women's Leadership Forum, you should join it, and do what they're doing. So I joined the club, and I went to the first meeting, and it was in the River Club in New York City. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. It's a very fancy tennis club, and there's a room full of women once again. And I was youngest by about 20 or 30 years. And our speaker was Hillary Clinton. And she spoke to this room of women, and she said something that has always stuck with me. She said, in Washington, decisions are being made every day. And if you don't like what they decide and you're not involved in politics, you have no one to blame but yourself. And that really hit me because I thought, wow, she's talking to me. I started to sweat in my little silk blue suit, thinking, oh no, she's telling me I have to run for office and I'm not ready. But it was a wake-up call to say that all of us have a role to play and that our voices individually and collectively are very important. So that's how I got my start in politics. In a time of great political division, I'm consistently reminded her of those words. We can't sit on the sidelines. We can't just wait for someone else to do the thing. We can't expect that our government's going to work well without us. In fact, it's only going to work with us. It only works when we march on Washington. It only works when we get the vote out. It only works when we organize and make sure people are aware of how we feel and what we want done. That's what democracy means. John F. Kennedy once said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That wasn't just a call to public service. It was a reminder of the role this democracy plays in the world. It was a reminder of the role we play in this democracy. And it was a reminder that you can never, never lose sight of its importance. But getting to public service is hard. When I first wanted to get to public service, I couldn't find my way. I was a fancy lawyer in New York City. I first applied to a bunch of charities. I applied to the Carnegie Corporation, the Rockefeller Foundation. I applied to be a U.S. attorney. I didn't get any interviews. I didn't get any jobs. I wanted to work on Hillary Clinton's first Senate campaign. Walked in, said, I'd love to work on your campaign. Well, they said, well, do you need a paid position? And I said, yes, I have to pay my bills. And they said, well, you don't have the right experience. So I couldn't get that job. And then I walked into an event, and Andrew Cuomo, our then Secretary of HUD, was the speaker, and he gave a speech about public service and why being a Democrat mattered. And I kind of stormed up to him after this speech and said, well, you know, it's not that easy. I've been trying to get a public service job, and it seems to be an insider's game. Well, pretty much on the spot, he said, will you come to Washington and work for me? And I said, yes. 2 weeks later, I left my big fancy law firm job and found myself as a special counsel at HUD. So I found my way. But when that job ended because of Bush v. Gore and there were no more appointed positions, I thought, well, maybe I have to run for office. And I decided to run for Congress. I ran in upstate New York. It was a 2-to-1 Republican district. No one thought I could win except for my mother. My pollster told me there were more cows than Democrats in my district. But I persevered, I overcame, and I won that district. So as a public servant today, I've been thinking long and hard about that. How do I get more young people into public service? So one of the bipartisan ideas that we just put into place was in this last defense bill is the first ever National Cyber Academy. Now think about this. The toughest jobs to fill in Washington right now are these cyber jobs, these tech jobs of the smartest computer engineers, the smartest coders, the smartest people in STEM, because they go off and they work for the Googles and the Facebooks. We need them in government. We need them at the NSA. We need them at the CIA. We need them in the Space Force. So Senator Rounds and I, a Republican, decided we are going to create the first ever Cyber Academy. And so next year, the first class of kids will be applying, 1,000 kids. They can go to any of the 200 schools that have been vetted by the NSA all across the state, 15 in New York State, all across the country, community colleges, state schools, elite schools like Stanford and MIT. As long as you get in, the federal government will pay your full tuition if you go 5 years of public service in cyber. So I think we should maybe close to get to the conversation, but I did want to end with one more thing about equal rights. This country and this state has such a huge legacy in fighting for equal rights. It was Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman who was from New York. She was right down the street from, I think, Binghamton. They wrote the first Equal Rights Amendment, and it was something set in motion 100 years ago, but we still don't have it. That's strange. Why wouldn't we have an Equal Rights Amendment? So we looked into it and said, what does it take to have an Equal Rights Amendment? Well, the Constitution requires 2 things. It requires you to pass both houses of Congress by 2/3. We've actually already done that. It requires you to pass 2/3 of the states, has to ratify it. We've already done that. So why don't we have an Equal Rights Amendment? Well, some argue that the law that was passed had a preamble that had a time limit. Well, that's a preamble. Preambles are not laws. They are not dispositive. So we wrote a piece of legislation, me and a member of the House, to actually say all that's needed to have an Equal Rights Amendment right now is for it to be signed by the archivist and published. And we believe that is not only a novel, but legitimate legal theory, and we are going to push our case with this archivist, with this president, and try to get it signed and published so we have an Equal Rights Amendment. So I'm going to reserve the rest of my speech for Q&A because I think it's far more interesting to have questions and answers than be read a speech. But I just want to thank you all for being here. I think it is such a privilege to come talk to you today, especially during this week and what you are talking about. I think it's a privilege to serve all of you who are New Yorkers in the U.S. Senate, and I just want to extend my deepest gratitude to every single one of you. God bless.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to just talk a little bit in this week on, our full title for the week is Freedom of Expression, Imagination, and the Resilience of Democracy. And I want to start with where you ended, which is your advocacy for the Equal Rights Amendment. And to ask you in today's context, assuming the archivist signs it and it's published, what will it change? What will it do?
It's a huge opportunity. So already in this country, many states have passed their own individual Equal Rights Amendment. In fact, New York is going to pass its own. We're going to have a ballot initiative next year so we can vote on our own ERA, which will be very powerful. It's a great organizing principle. It gets people out to vote. It crosses party lines. But that Equal Rights Amendment has already been used in 2 states when the legislatures there tried to pass laws that abrogated women's reproductive freedom. They found that that was unconstitutional in their state constitutions because if you don't have bodily autonomy and you don't get to decide whether you're going to live or die or get medical procedures that you need to live or die, you don't have equal rights. And that was held up in court. So I am very optimistic that if we can get an Equal Rights Amendment passed in the United States Constitution to be our 28th Amendment, that we can then use that to apply to all of these laws across the country that are implementing Dobbs in a way that undermines not just access to one medical procedure, but access to any right to privacy, access to having confidential communications with your mom on Facebook about your medical care, the ability to travel across states for parents to take a 10-year-old girl who's been raped across state lines to get a medical procedure. Those abrogation of rights are truly taking away equality in this country. Women are being treated as second-class citizens and truly said, if you are a woman in reproductive years, you have no civil rights and civil liberties to bodily autonomy. That's unconscionable, and we have to fight back against it.